Oh, it's Tuesday, February 14th, Valentine's Day, 2017, and this is 3000 NFL Mock Draft, the weekly draft podcast where myself, Kenneth Arthur of Field Goals, and Rob Staten of SeahawksDraftBlog.com get together and discuss the Seahawks, the draft, the football, NFL, college. Oh, man, it's all about that kind of stuff. I guess today there is an extra hint of love in the air. I know that Rob's family got a little bit bigger, so there's a little bit more love going on over there across the pond. I'm sitting here in my apartment by myself in front of a laptop recording a podcast. So also pretty lucky myself. So there is that bit of info. And today we're going to talk about the Seahawks and their draft needs and their overall needs. Everyone's needs are draft needs and free agency and trade needs up until they're fulfilled and so on and so forth. And, of course, a lot of that will revolve around the draft. The scouting combine begins in 2 weeks. The free agency begins around March 9th, I believe. Teams can give the franchise or transition tag on the 15th of February, so on Wednesday, tomorrow as we record this. And those are some of the key dates leading up to the draft at the end of April. And we'll talk about some mock drafts that have been posted recently by Daniel Jeremiah, Todd McShay, Charlie Casserly, and sort of talk about how that might affect, Rob's next version of his mock draft and where the Seahawks could be, who the Seahawks could be getting, whether or not a trade up seems maybe a little bit more likely this year than in years past, or if it's going to be another trade down, or we'll just sort of devolve and talk about all that kind of stuff. But let's start everything with the Seahawks needs. As far as the players the Seahawks will be losing, there's probably Luke Wilson, the tight end. It looks like maybe they've signed Blair Walsh since we've last recorded a show, so that means Stephen Hauschka could not be returning potentially. Walsh signed a $950,000 one-year deal, and a few others are free agents like Mike Morgan. I should have pulled this up first, but we'll talk about the needs there. But I think the biggest needs are going to come from injuries like that of Deshaun Shedd, or maybe poor play like that of wide receiver Jermaine Kearse, and that kind of thing. So, Rob, what would be your top 3 needs for the Seahawks right now? And if you want to go out to a top 5 or top 6, the world is your oyster.
Well, I think there's kind of 2 ways of looking at it. There's the needs that I think Pete Carroll and John Schneider probably think that they need, and then there are needs that some of the fans will think they will need. And I think a lot of fans will probably point to the offensive line, and they will probably look at other positions. I get a lot of people on the blog talking about receiver and running back and positions like that. But we heard very clearly from Pete Carroll in his end of season press conference that he believes, the biggest priority needs are cornerback. He wants some more talent at cornerback. He believes that, and he made this long answer about how he wants to get better at linebacker, that essentially they have Bobby Wagner and KJ Wright, who played nearly 100% of the defensive snaps in 2016, that he feels they need some more competition there. I suspect that they also feel like they never properly replaced Bruce Irvin and Malcolm Smith. It's easy to forget how often Malcolm Smith was playing for the Seahawks when they won a Super Bowl at the end of 2013. He was playing it, as 90% of the snaps to end the year. And they lost him, and then they lost Bruce Irvin, and they never really replaced that guy. They basically had Mike Morgan there, sort of playing sparingly, and then trying to fit in guys like Cassius Marsh, for example, or Frank Clark, or players like that, sort of listing them as an extra linebacker in certain down and distances. But they never really replaced that guy. So I think they're probably going to draft a linebacker relatively early to play that role. And the other position he mentioned was offensive line. So that, kind of stating the obvious there. I think it's probably likely that they will go out and add a running back at some point just to add some competition, whether that's a day 2 or day 3 pick, whether that is a free agent that they're able to acquire, whether that's they do a trade with somebody to bring in another running back. I'm not sure. I think that they have a degree of faith in Thomas Rawls still and CJ Prosise. and Alex Collins and the group that they've got, but I think they will want to add one more body to that competition to replace the fact that they've lost Kristen Michael from 12 years ago. So I think a running back will come in at some point. But I don't expect that to be an early pick. And apart from that, it's pretty much just depth. It's a bit of safety depth. It might be that they draft a player who can play cornerback or safety, for example, if it's someone like Obi Melifonwu. But ultimately, I think a bit of depth at safety as well is something they're going to look at.
And with the last 2 weeks since me and you have last spoken, and with some of the other like mock drafts, I mean, I guess my first question would be, I'm trying to think. Not much has happened. Has anything happened in terms of prospects or anything in the last 2 weeks that would change anyone's stock in terms of reports? I know that there's at least one report. There's a couple injury reports, if I'm correct, of guys that may have undergone surgery and everything like that. Any of the players maybe that you've mocked to the Seahawks in the last couple months that now you're sort of taking off the board in the first round?
There's nothing that's maybe taken anybody off the board for the Seahawks, but what there has been, Kenny, is sort of guys boosting their stock. So we saw at the Senior Bowl a fantastic performance by Hassan Reddick, who is a guy we've talked about an awful lot this year. When I've done mock drafts in the past, I've been putting him in. In December, I put him to the Seahawks at 26. Or wherever I was putting them in at that point because the season hadn't finished. But I was mocking him to the Seahawks in the first round. In the past, I've had him to the Seahawks in round 2. And then he goes to the Senior Bowl and just has a sensational display every single day. And it feels like he's boosted his stock potentially into a range where if he went at number 16 to Baltimore or 17 to Washington, it wouldn't be a big surprise. He could go to 22 to Miami. So he might be off the board before the Seahawks even pick. This is a guy that we followed a lot during the college season on the blog, and often talked about, someone that they might be very interested in. And now we're talking about him potentially not even being there with their first pick. So, he's taken a huge jump forward. You could maybe even say the same about someone like Obi Melifonwu, who, all of the reports from the Senior Bowl is that he blew coaches away with his performance, and that he might be moving up the boards as well. So there are players that the Seahawks may have been interested in sort of a few weeks ago that they thought they had a realistic chance of getting, that are maybe sort of moving too far up the board now, and I think the combine will make that situation even worse for them. In terms of players that I looked at that I'm no longer considering, I've had to strike off players like Tre'Davious White purely because they don't pass the 32-inch arms test that we've often talked about with cornerbacks. They've not drafted a single cornerback with shorter arms than 32 inches. Tre'Davious White falls into that category. I've had to cross off Cam Sutton because I think he had something ridiculous like 29.5-inch arms, which is just not going to cut it for the Seahawks. Adam Bisnawati, we've talked about an awful lot, had very short arms at the Senior Bowl, another player that now seems unlikely to be an option for them. And, I know a lot of people like Forrest Lamp, but I just have a very hard time imagining the Seahawks taking a guy with 31-inch arms to play the offensive line. I don't think they've taken anybody close to that in the draft with that lack of length. So he's the T-Rex, as you like to call them. So I don't think that he's going to be an option for them either. Thankfully, it's a really interesting deep draft where you can have 5 or 6 different crushers. I've probably sort of thought in the last month alone, I'd love to get this guy and I'd love to get this guy, and I could reel off a list of names that I'd love the Seahawks to draft, and they'll probably only be able to get one of these names. So it's a really interesting in draft in that regard, but it's also going to be one of those situations where you'll be really happy about the player they draft with the first pick, but you'll be really disappointed to see sort of 5 or 6 of the guys going to other teams.
So before we get into some of the mock drafts, how would you say that these position groups in the 2017 NFL draft sort of affect the way to fill the needs that the Seahawks do have at the positions that you mentioned? Based on the, say, cornerbacks and offensive linemen, what do you expect them to take first, and what do you expect them to maybe wait to target on day 3, if not, in free agency and even an undrafted free agency, where it's almost a sure thing that 1 or 2 or 3 guys that they sign after the draft are going to make the final roster.
Well, thankfully, in terms of the needs at cornerback and safety and linebacker, this is a really good draft for those positions. It's a lot of people have talked about how great it is at cornerback, and they're absolutely right. There are some great options at cornerback. It's also a really good draft for linebackers. I think that it's maybe a little bit top heavy. I think if you're going to get one, you may have to do it with the first or second round pick if you want to get a really good linebacker. But there's going to be a few that go in that sort of top 60. Just to give you some examples here of the kind of players that you could be looking at. In the first round, we've talked about Hassan Reddick. He might be sort of the ideal Seahawks pick in the first round with his combination of character, grit, his tenacity, his speed, his all-round athleticism. Is a freaky athlete, and his major college production at Temple. So he could be kind of like the ideal pick for the Seahawks at 26. If it's not him, you could imagine someone like Zach Cunningham being an option for them, or Jared Davis at Florida. Really long, athletic, fly to the ball linebackers. You could imagine them being possible targets. And then in round 2, you could be looking at people like Tyus Bowser, who's at Houston, really, really athletic again. Alex Anzalone from Florida, a player we've talked about in the past. So, I think that if they're going to target linebacker, it might be maybe one of those guys, and probably in the first 2 rounds. I think that if they're going to draft a cornerback, they could pretty much do it at any point they want to, because it could be that we have to wait to see who has the 32-inch arms. But let's just suggest that there's a decent chance that Kevin King from Washington is going to pass that test, given his height. So you would imagine that he could be an option if he tests as well as he did at the Husky Combine a year ago. That would make him quite a freaky athlete, especially if he can run in the 4.5s and not have such an issue with the long speed there. As long as his long speed is acceptable, his quickness over the short range, his jumping ability.
How freakish is 32-inch arms for a cornerback? Like, is that something like in the 95th percentile? Like, how insane or how unlikely is it for a cornerback to have 32-inch arms?
I think nearly it's not unusual, but nearly all of the top class cornerbacks in the NFL have 32-inch arms. If you actually go along and look at it, it's kind of weird, really, how it's such a consistent trend. Length is really important with cornerbacks, and there are exceptions to the rule. Marcus Peters, I think, has 31.5-inch arms, but you're talking about half an inch there. People like Charles Harris have obscenely long arms, 33.5 inches, despite only being 5'10". It's consistently there. That you're going to need 32-inch arms plus. There's a reason why the Seahawks have got that barrier, and that's probably because the research they've done has suggested that that's an important factor for a cornerback. But Kevin King's got the overall profile. It's just the long speed that people have a concern with him. And I think he's really, really good, Kevin King, and he could be an option for them. At 26. I think that Melifonwu, we know, has got 32-inch arms and has got great size and could be a chess piece defender that they use at cornerback in the slot at safety. You could imagine the Seahawks drafting that guy. I could imagine them drafting Rasul Douglas, the receiver at West Virginia, quite early. Fabian Moreau from UCLA, you could imagine them looking at him. So that could be a position that they look at in the first 2 rounds. I think the one area they're going to find it really difficult to draft for, Kenny, is the offensive line, because I think that Garrett Bowles is going to go very early, probably in the top 15. Ryan Ramczyk, who might be another option for them, I don't think he's going to last at 26. And after that, I just don't see the high pick that the Seahawks would take for that. I don't think they're going to go for guard again. I think it'd have to be an offensive tackle. And when you start looking at that, you kind of think, well, who is out there? Who would they realistically go for? And I think you kind of imagine that in that situation, you're talking about, unless they're going to go for someone like Taylor Moton or Dion Dawkins, that they're probably going to wait on this position or address it in free agency. I think that if you want to see a tackle coming in, I think it has to be almost a veteran. You have to find a way to add a veteran, because it's going to be really difficult to get a solution there in this draft, unless it's someone like Chad Wheeler really late on, who's maybe got some athletic potential there, but is going to be in exactly the same position that maybe the likes of Gilliam and Fant have been at, is that they're really raw and need time, which is not really the answer for the Seahawks. So O-line could be an issue for them. I think running back into the round 3. Round 3 to 5 could be an area they look at. I still think Elijah Hood is a guy that could easily be the one that they target. Given the trend that they have for size and athleticism, he kind of ticks those boxes. And I think that sort of depth late on in the secondary is going to be big. So whether it's Shalom Luani that we've talked about at Washington State, I can still imagine the Seahawks liking him. Treston Deku at Oregon State, cornerback. Marquez White, Akella Witherspoon, cornerback at Colorado, and some other guys that have been looking at recently. Two really interesting guys. Tedrick Thompson, who is a safety at Colorado, had a whole bunch of interceptions, has got fantastic range and speed. His brother's in the NFL. He had a fantastic workout at the combine. I think Tedrick Thompson is a name to really keep an eye on if they want to add some depth at free safety. He is somebody that they could show interested in. And Howard Wilson is a guy at Houston who has got some slot corner potential. He's got the length, looks to have the length, has got great athleticism, makes plays. I think his interception rate, Kenny, is, I can't remember what it is off the top of my head, but it's something ridiculous, like 1 in every 10 targets ends up in a pick. He's got fantastic production in terms of turning the ball over, and was expected to potentially be a William Jackson III type riser this year. There was some hope that he might even push his way into sort of the first round contention. He's not quite developed that level of hype. But he could be somebody that maybe in round 3 or round 4, maybe you're looking at and thinking there's a lot of value there, a lot of potential with somebody like that. So Howard Wilson at Houston's another name to keep an eye
on. We're gonna, on one other Seahawks draft note today, just being that despite rumors that they could get docked as much as the 2nd round pick for not disclosing Richard Sherman's knee injury. The story today being that the Seahawks will not be docked anything, and they've still had to give up a 5th round pick because of their training camp violations last year. And that was supposedly going to get bumped up to as much as a 2nd round pick, but no punishment like that coming forth. And with comp picks, reading the Davis Sue Seattle's tweet, just saying that the Seahawks draft picks should be 1st round, 2nd round, 2 3rd-round picks, a 5th, a 6th, and a 7th, with comp picks in the 3rd and the 5th. So the Seahawks still have 7 draft picks, including 3 on day 2, which is nice, and none in round 4 as of yet, though I'm sure that they are already thinking about what kind of deals could be on the table to move down and maybe pick up a 4th round pick or pick up some additional picks there or next year, as they are wont to do. Just moving on to some of these mock drafts, I want to talk about generally the draft, and not just the Seahawks, but some of draft stuff as well, and some of the trends and some of the most important things that are going to be talked about in the next 2 months leading up to the draft. Every year the top story is the top pick. Right now, Myles Garrett to the Browns at number 1 is unequivocally the only thing that you'll see in pretty much any mock draft, I feel like. Nobody feels that there's a quarterback that is that is clearly a franchise quarterback. So Myles Garrett seems to be this can't miss outside linebacker pass rushing prospect. Rob, first of all, how out of the realms of possibility is it that a quarterback, after the combine and the interviews and all that kind of stuff, that one of these quarterbacks will seem can't miss to a team, whether it's the Browns or a team that wants to trade up to number 1? Because I think the Browns are more than willing to entertain trading down. So how likely is it, do you think, one of these quarterbacks could do something like that over the next couple months? And second of all, with all the talk about Myles Garrett, being the universal number 1 overall pick, like which player in the past would you compare him to, whether it's a Mario Williams or someone else that was this highly regarded as a prospect that was going to go number 1 overall? Where does he rank among the sort of number 1 picks?
I think he looked like he was the type of player, Kenny, that as soon as he arrived at Texas A&M, he just looked like he was going to be a top 2 or 3 pick. I remember the first time I watched him play, and you were like, "Ooh, who's that? He looks really good." And then the commentators were saying, he's a former really high recruit, that he's going to be a top pick. And then the more and more you watch him, it just felt obvious. It was the same with Leonard Fournette. They were kind of like both arrived on the scene at the same time, and both players looked as if they were destined to be really high draft picks. So I think that who is he sort of compared to? I think there's maybe a bit of Von Miller in him. You sort of see that quickness off the edge. Maybe his size, I think maybe he can be a bigger frame, but that doesn't really impact Von Miller's game at all. But that's the kind of talent, and potential that you're talking about there. In terms of the quarterback class, I think there's a couple of thoughts I have on this. First of all, I really don't understand how a year ago we have nearly every major draft pundit and draft media expert and talking head, really, really praising the likes of Jared Goff and talking about how good he's going to be and how he's a potential number 1 overall pick, and very little criticism of Goff or any talk whatsoever of some of the flaws within his game. He and Carson Wentz got a really comfortable ride from draft media, and yet the likes of Deshaun Watson, who are not a flawless prospect by any stretch. But, did Jared Goff look any better in his 3 years at California than Deshaun Watson has in winning a national championship and doing what he's done? Arguably not. And, Mitch Trubisky's only played 13 games for North Carolina, but still, you could see a lot of talent there. There's a lot to like with Trubisky. I don't quite understand why there's this big difference between almost like the untouchable Goff and, similarly, Carson Wentz, really highly rated, and yet you struggle to find people talk positively about this quarterback class. What I think is going to happen, and we're sort of seeing a shift now. Jason LaCanfora, who's very well connected, works for CBS, has touted the idea that we are actually going to see quarterbacks going quite early. So he believes that it's likely if Arizona wants to get at Deshaun Watson, they will have to trade up from number 13. So first and foremost, it looks as if there's a chance there, if you want to believe this report by LaCanfora, or this assertion by him, that Watson's going to be off the board by number 13. If you assume that Trubisky's also going to be off the board in that situation, that's 2 quarterbacks probably going in the top 10. And he even suggested, this is LaCanfora, that Patrick Mahomes at Texas Tech is going to firmly establish himself at least as the 3rd best quarterback in this class, and maybe not, if not sort of the 1st or the 2nd. And the floor for him in terms of the draft is going to be number 25 in Houston. So if you assume that there's a chance that Mahomes is going to be off the board by 25, he's probably going to go a bit earlier than that. So I just wonder whether or not we'll see a situation where Kyle Shanahan at number 2 and John Lynch will say, we need a quarterback, a young quarterback who can lead this franchise, and we accept that they're going to need some time to learn the Kyle Shanahan way of doing things on offense. The sooner they get that guy, the better, because the last thing the 49ers need is to be wasting a year with no developed quarterback, and needing to then spend a year developing said quarterback, because it puts you 2 years behind. They're in a major rebuild, and this rebuild is going to be built around the passing offense and Kyle Shanahan. So they need to get a quarterback in this system as soon as possible. So whether that's a trade or for someone who's already in the league, or whether it's a rookie, I think that it's probably likely that the 49ers are going to do something there. And I think what will end up happening is they will look at Trubisky and Watson and make their pick on who they want to take. And then there are other teams in the top 10. So, Chicago, if they can't do a deal for Jimmy Garoppolo, might have to consider it. Buffalo appear to bizarrely ready to move on from Tyrod Taylor. And if they do that, they're going to need a quarterback as well. And I just wonder, with the aggressiveness they showed to get Sammy Watkins, whether or not Buffalo might be willing to move up from number 10 to get ahead of New York and to try and take Arizona out of this to get Deshaun Watson, and whether someone like Tennessee at number 5, who have traded down in the past, might be willing to do like a little swap of picks with Buffalo, so that Buffalo could go up and get Deshaun Watson maybe at number 5, for example. And then, Arizona might be at 13 thinking, maybe we'll trade down a little bit and look at someone like Patrick Mahomes to redshirt for a year to have them sit behind Carson Palmer, learn the Bruce Arians offense, and potentially become the starter in a year's time. So we could see three. I genuinely think there's a chance we could see 3 quarterbacks leaving the board early. I put some faith in what Lacanfor is saying there. I'm not convinced that we're going to see all of these quarterbacks drop out of the top 10 or 15, because as we saw last year, teams are always in the market for these players. And even though Jared Goff and Carson Wentz weren't the 2 best players in the draft a year ago, they still went number 1 and number 2. And that's not going to end anytime soon. That's always going to be the case. And I think we are going to see quarterbacks leaving the board very early again this year.
With the you mentioned 49ers a bit there, and some Seahawks related type news for the 49ers with them. I mean, they're building their team with Kyle Shanahan as the head coach and offensive coordinator, and Shanahan working for the last 2 years under Dan Quinn, who of course comes from the Pete Carroll tree, so they're getting some stuff there. But also they named their defensive coordinator today, and he comes from the Jacksonville Jaguars, and he was with the Seahawks from 2011 to 2013. And so they're now, switching their defense from a 3-4 to a 4-3 under, for their base, leaving them plenty of leeway there to have 3-4 personnel at the defensive end and linebacker positions, while still pretty much sitting up in a 4-3 for most of the time. And so I guess we've talked a lot about Eric Armstead and DeForest Buckner on the podcast, and the types of players that they've been getting for that defense. And now they sit here at the number 2 pick, and what kind of player that they will be targeting if it's not a quarterback, if it's going to be a defensive player, because there are defensive linemen like Jonathan Allen, and there's linebackers like Reuben Foster, and there's different ways. I mean, there's Solomon Thomas. I think any of these guys. With the 49ers moving to that sort of defense, what does it mean for Armstead and Buckner and the players they already have on the roster? And what does it mean for perhaps their draft needs? Is anyone out there like a perfect set like Leo and that kind of thing?
And, I think with the defense that they'll find a way to fit those guys in, and if not, they will have some trade value, and maybe they can move things around. I think when you're a team like San Francisco that have got so many needs, it's not such a bad thing when you do have 1 or 2 assets to try and turn them into other players that you actually want. And they have those 2 guys there on the defensive line. They're okay. Can you find a trade partner maybe to sort of move them? Either get some picks or get some players and do kind of what the Seahawks did with Carroll and Schneider 7 years ago, which is just sort of churn through some guys, bring some players in, try and find a spark somewhere, try and find some leadership, some fits. So that is what I would be trying to do. If there are players in there that they don't think fit their defense, move them to a defense where they do fit and see what you can get in return. In terms of what is in this draft that could help them, I mean, it comes back to, what are the 49ers? How are they going to build this thing? They've appointed Kyle Shanahan. They've given him somewhat of the control, from what I understand, from what I heard. They've given him control of personnel. John Lynch is going to be heavily involved as well, of course, but it seems like this is the Kyle Shanahan project. And if you are going to put your faith in Kyle Shanahan to make you a winning team, having just watched what they have done in Atlanta, he's going to need a quarterback. He's going to need an offense. He's going to need people to throw the ball to. He's going to need protection, and he's going to need a quarterback. I just cannot. As I've sort of said, I think there's a chance Solomon Thomas could go there, for example. I've looked at other defensive players who could go there. I just increasingly am starting to think there is nothing to be gained from San Francisco unless they bring in a veteran quarterback to lead this thing over the next few years, like Jimmy Garoppolo, for example. There's nothing to be gained from delaying this another year to bring in the quarterback that you're going to develop. You might as well draft them at number 2 to the fan base. This is our guy. We're going to stash him for now. We're going to redshirt him. We're going to develop him. We're going to make him learn this offense, and we're going to build around this guy. And in the meantime, you bring in somebody, I know it's not going to be glamorous, but you bring in a Matt Schaub, you bring in a Jay Cutler, and you say that is going to be our bridge quarterback. and then you develop this guy so that he can lead this team for the future, and then you just spend all the rest of your picks building around them. So go and get a receiver at the top of round 2. If you can move back into the first round and get a really dynamic receiver, great, do it. If you can get a great tight end, do it. Put some weapons around the quarterback. I think that's how they have to build this thing. And the defensive side of the ball, they do have some parts that can build around. Navarro Bowman's coming back, really good player. You mentioned the defensive lineman they've got there. They have got some young players in the secondary that they might feel that, they want to stick with. And it's a really deep draft at cornerback, so they could probably get 1 or 2 pieces at cornerback or safety in the middle rounds as well. So they're going to have some options there, but I think this has to be, how can we implement the Kyle Shanahan vision for this team ASAP? And that probably means meeting with Mitch Trubisky at the combine, meeting with Deshaun Watson at the combine, meeting with Patrick Mahomes at the combine, meeting with Deshaun Kaiser at the combine, and deciding which one has got the mental capacity to pick up your offense the quickest, and then selecting them, because they've all got talent, and it's all about which one you genuinely want to develop. And I think that when all's said and done, it'll come down to Trubisky and Watson.
Moving down the draft a little bit, you've got the Bears at 3, the Jaguars at 4, the Titans at 5. And such a good move for the Titans to pick up an extra first-round pick last year. And, now they're sitting here and they have an opportunity to get someone perhaps like Reuben Foster and, really add to a team that seems to be on the way up. And then Leonard Fournette, they got the Jets at 6 and the Chargers at 7. And, what the Chargers have to do right now is kind of interesting. There's a lot of different ways that they could go. And Gus Bradley is their defensive coordinator. And then the Panthers at 8. Within all of these top 10 picks, where do you see Leonard Fournette landing? Because that's something that we've talked about a lot in the last 3 years, is Leonard Fournette. In Daniel Jeremiah's mock draft, he's got him going to the Jets there at number 6. And then in the Charlie Casserly's mock draft, he goes number 4 to the Jaguars. It doesn't, other than you look at it, you see that the 49ers have Carlos Hyde, but I think they have a need. I think there's definitely a place there for Leonard Fournette should they decide to go that route. The Bears are fine with Jordan Howard. The Jaguars obviously could use him. The Titans have DeMarco Murray and Derrick Henry, and then the Jets and the Chargers have Melvin Gordon. But the Panthers, there's another team that gets mocked to a lot in terms of him, and they've never been shy about drafting running backs early. Where do you see Leonard Fournette going, and what's going to be the best situation for him in an Ezekiel Elliott type situation to really do everything that he's capable of doing next season?
Well, the best situation for him is probably Carolina at number 8. So if he can drop there, because of the read option aspects of Cam Newton, and if they can get the offensive line sorted again, this is a team that went 15-1 just a year ago, went to the Super Bowl. So I would think that probably Carolina is the best situation for him. Plus, they love to run the ball. Jonathan Stewart's had a very good spell there. So I can imagine that would be maybe the best case scenario for him. I mean, he could go at any point. I mean, it wouldn't be a shock if Jacksonville took him, if they just thought, hey, we need to support Blake Bortles. We've invested a lot of early draft stock in the defense. We can get a cornerback or a safety at the top of round 2 because the depth is there. Let's just go and get a dynamic weapon like Leonard Fournette. So you could see Jacksonville going in that direction. The Jets have traditionally, Mike McCagnon, who's the GM there, basically just takes the best. He is very much of the best player available methodology. And, a lot of teams say that, and they take best player available at a position of need. He takes BPA. So, it was Leonard Williams a couple of years ago, even though they already had some great defensive linemen. That is the kind of thing that they do. So I think if Leonard Fournette's there at 6, the Jets may well just take him, because I think Fournette will be the best player available, and they will just see, a young dynamic talent that they want to build around. And he is that good. I mean, you hear so much. I've seen so many mock drafts I think if you see a mock draft where Leonard Fournette drops out of the top 10, you should just go and close the tab as soon as possible, because if Todd Gurley could go 10th overall with a torn ACL, the idea that Leonard Fournette's going to drop out of the top 10 is just obscene. I mean, he is a fantastic, fantastic player that every team in the league would love to have. And the only reason that some teams won't draft him is purely because they are bad teams at the top of the draft that are drafting for different positions because of the positional value. That is the only reason why anybody is going to pass on Leonard Fournette. Everybody would love to have him. Every single scheme, every single offense, every single coach would love to have Leonard Fournette. And the team that gets him is going to be really lucky, because they're going to get possibly the best player in the draft, probably the second best player in the draft, if not the first, at number 6 or number 8 or something like that, or number 4. And it's going to be a bargain for them. So I think that probably Carolina's the lowest point that he will fall to, possibly more likely to be number 4 to Jacksonville or number 6 to New York. And I think I mentioned it a little while ago. I think there's a legitimate chance that Tennessee, Kenny, will look to trade down for number 5. Their biggest need is cornerback. If they could drop down 5 or 6 spots, they could probably feel really good about the value they're getting at the cornerback position there. That's the kind of range where you would expect someone like Marlon Humphrey or Sidney Jones to come off the board. So if they can drop 5 or 6 places and get the cornerback, they may well do that. And yep, it might be a team moving up to get a quarterback, but don't rule out a team moving up to get Leonard Fournette, because he is that good.
Let's talk about the wide receivers real quick, because I did see a mock draft recently that had the Seahawks taking Isaiah Ford, and I think the first or second round. And I think that was the SB Nation podcast by Dan Kadar. He had the Seahawks taking Isaiah Ford, wide receiver out of Virginia Tech. And if you look at the mock drafts right now, there's a lot of variability, I think, because if you look at Daniel Jeremiah's mock draft, he's got Mike Williams being the top receiver going at number 9, and then Corey Davis going at number 13, and then John Ross going at 18, the receiver out of Washington. And that's it for the receivers in the first round. But then if you take it to Charlie Casserly, he's got Mike Williams going 15th overall, John Ross going 16th overall, and Corey Davis falling down to 23rd overall. So what are your thoughts right now on the order of those guys, Corey Davis, which one may be the best, and what are your thoughts on Isaiah Ford?
I haven't watched a great deal of Isaiah Ford, but I'm not convinced that from what little I've seen that he's going to be somebody they'll target really quickly or really early. I think there's a chance the receivers could fall a little bit. I think Todd McShay put Corey Davis at number 5 overall in his mock draft, and I listened to the first draft podcast today, and McShay was pretty much saying that he put him there just to be a talking point. And I don't think that Corey Davis is going to go that early at all. Maybe if Tennessee trades down, they would consider that, but I really cannot see him going that early. I think he is a little bit overrated. I think that, he's a good player, nice player to watch, fun player to watch, but I pumped up too much. And I'd probably say the same for Mike Williams as well. I mean, there were games in 2016, and this is despite the fact that Clemson are, superior talent, superior recruiting classes, very experienced quarterback, really dynamic offense, became the national champions. And there were games last year where Mike Williams just did not have an impact. He's got a nice skill set. He will be an asset to somebody who drafts him. I don't think he's going to have a fantastic combine workout, which is important. And I just don't think he's going to go as early as some people have suggested. I think the one guy who might go really early is John Ross. And I know the injury concerns are there, and people have talked about that, and teams will have to do their homework on John Ross in that regard. But there's every chance that he's going to turn up at the combine in 3 weeks and run a 4.29. And it's funny how that shapes a team's belief in a guy. And when you actually watch the tape, he's not just a guy who runs downfield and gets separation because he can run faster than anybody else. He gets separation on, with a fantastic release. He's explosive out of his breaks, and he constantly wins very early in the route to gain separation and get open. And it's a bit like Deshaun Jackson when he was at his best without any of the headaches in terms of character. And I could see a team sort of saying, this is just a really, really dynamic player that we have to have. And when you look at someone like Baltimore, who have lost Steve Smith, Mike Wallace is due $8 million in 2017. I'm not convinced that Baltimore are going to want to pay him $8 million. They can save, I think he's only 2.5 million dead cap. So they could save, a considerable amount of money there, $5.5 million, I think, to cut Mike Wallace. And you bring in John Ross, and you say Joe Flacco can throw to him deep. He can get open very quickly. He's the kind of dynamic weapon you don't have on offense. I could see Baltimore as early as 16 looking at him. I could see Tampa Bay at 19 looking at John Ross. He's a really good football player. So I think that he's probably being underrated, and I think the other two guys are being overrated. When I do my next mock draft, I'm going to represent that. I'm going to have Mike Williams and Corey Davis falling a little bit, and I'm going to have John Ross going pretty high.
Is there any, because wide receiver tends to be a position where personality, comes into play a lot more. A lot of divas, a lot of egos. It's a position that sort of puts, more than any other position, it puts the player on display for how amazing they are athletically. They score touchdowns. Being able to do stuff like that. And you do have your humble guys, like I don't know, DeAndre Hopkins or someone like that, or someone that doesn't stand out because they don't try to make them stand out. And then you've got your big name guys that do amazing things and wanting to make sure that you know about it. And I think about guys like because you mentioned Deshaun Jackson, I think about guys like Randy Moss and Terrell Owens that didn't go, as high as they would have been based just on their ability alone. Any receivers in this draft that you think, like a Deshaun Jackson will go maybe not in the first round or fall out of the top 20 or something like that because of their attitudes, but 2-3 years down the line will be, making all the highlights and be the talk of the league for wide receivers?
It's hard to sort of think who that could be in this draft class. I mean, potentially it could be someone, I guess, like D.D. Westbrook. There are some character issues there, I think. He might fall as a consequence of that. He's very, very quick. He could be very explosive, so he could be somebody that falls into that category. Demore Stringfellow has not been invited to the combine because of some of off-field issues that he has. Big target, he could be somebody who, again, falls into that category. Noah Brown is kind of underrated from Ohio State and could go a little bit later than people sort of expect, and could be somebody that they look at. So there's quite a few options there. I think that Malachi Dupree might be. He's not got any character issues there, but he's tall, he's long, he's going to have a great vertical jump. He probably isn't going to have the fastest 40-yard dash at the combine, but I would be surprised if he doesn't have a 40-inch vertical at least. I think that he could go a little bit later in the draft just purely because LSU had a horrific quarterback situation. So he could present value for somebody. I think that Joe Chesson will provide value for somebody at the Michigan receiver. And I think one of the players, well, a couple of players actually really stood out at the Senior Bowl who could go quite early are Zay Jones at East Carolina and Tywon Taylor, who both played really well at the Senior Bowl. So I think that they are two players who could be really intriguing when it actually comes to the combine. And then, as we get into the draft, they could go a bit earlier than I think people expect.
Okay, let's try and for the loyal Seahawks fans that have been listening along right now, I see 7 of you waiting for more Seahawks first round talk. Let's get to some of these guys because just looking down the list, we've talked a lot about how it's not that great of a class for offensive linemen. And in Jeremiah's draft, I see, Forrest Lamp, Western Kentucky guard, going 17th overall. And then Ryan Ramczyk, Wisconsin tackle, going 20th overall. And then Garrett Bowles going 25th overall, the Utah tackle that we've talked a lot about so far. and he doesn't have any other offensive linemen going in the first round. And then in Casserly's draft, it's going to be Ryan Ramczyk at 18, Bowles at 20, Cam Robinson at 21. And the Seahawks take Christian McCaffrey instead of a offensive lineman. In Todd McShay's draft, you talked about this on SeahawksDraftBlog.com. He had them taking Cam Robinson, and you said that you don't believe that he's going to have the athletic profile that they're going to deem necessary for an offensive lineman. What are your thoughts on Forrest Lamp? It's a name that I'm hearing a lot recently in terms of, a guy that's really going to do well at the combine and move himself up quite a bit in this draft. And I mentioned earlier the Isaiah Ford thing. That was SB Nation, and Dan had them taking Garrett Bowles in the first round and Isaiah Ford, I think, in the third round. And then in the second round, he had them. Oh, this has changed. This has been updated. Now he's got Dalvin Tomlinson, defensive tackle out of Alabama, going 58th overall to the Seahawks in the second round. And then Anthony Walker, linebacker of Northwestern, going in the third round. I'm rambling again. Welcome to 3000 NFL Mock Draft. I do this from time to time. Let's refocus. Okay, refocus. Forrest Lamp, your thoughts, and offensive lineman in the first round. By the time it comes around, do you think there will be anyone the Seahawks really want at that point?
I don't. I think that what we're going to see is that I think they'd be really interested in Garrett Bowles, but I think that he's going to go really early. Could go in the top 10. I think if top 15 is pretty much certain. I think that the absolute worst case for him is Denver at number 20, which will take him off the board before Seattle's pick anyway. Ryan Ramczyk is another player that they may be interested in. It depends on his measurables. It depends on how they view the torn labrum that he's going to keep him at the combine. He's not going to do any pre-draft workouts. So, and you've only got 1 year of playing experience at Wisconsin to judge him on. So, he's potentially another option there that I think will go off the board before their pick. New York at number 23 might be his floor. I don't think Cam Robinson will be of too much interest to them personally. I think he's a guy who probably will move inside, and the Seahawks have been there, done that. Got 3 T-shirts with James Carpenter, Justin Britt, and now Jermaine Ifedi of players that they've drafted who played tackle in college and then had to kick inside. So I don't think they're going to have to do that. I don't think they're going to go down that road again. And with Forrest Lamp, the problem with Forrest Lamp is that his length. The Seahawks have drafted offensive linemen with, I think, 33-inch arms or more every time. And Forrest Lamp has got 31-inch arms. It really limits him to what he can potentially be. I think his best fit in the next level might even end up being center. He might start off as a guard and then move inside to center and have a really good career. But the Seahawks have found a center now with Justin Britt. So if you're going to draft Forrest Lamp in the first round, you're probably drafting him to play left guard. Is the absolute biggest priority for the Seahawks right now to replace Mark Glowinski? It probably isn't, at least not in the first round. If you want to replace Glowinski, go find a veteran, go find a mid-round pick, go take Dorian Johnson at Pittsburgh in round 2 to replace Mark Glowinski. Don't take Forrest Lamp at 26 and then put him at left guard, because it just seems like a wasted investment. If the Seahawks are going to spend big on the offensive line in the first round, it has to be on an offensive tackle, and this is just a bad draft for that, because Bowles is going to go early, Ramczyk's probably going to go early, Robinson might be a guard, Forrest Lamp is going to be a guard. The options just are not there. So if you're a Seahawks fan hoping for an upgrade at left or right tackle this offseason, you better start hoping that they've got a really creative trade in the pipeline for a veteran when free agency begins and the league year begins, or that they're going to be targeting, whether it's Whitworth at Cincinnati or Wagner at Baltimore or Rife at Detroit, or one of the sort of the second or third tier offensive linemen that they really believe can start and compete and do a better job than Bradley Sowell and Jamarcus Webb did a year ago.
And some of the other players there, I talked briefly about Christian McCaffrey and how he was mocked by Charlie Casserly. And I think we've talked about, I think you've talked about your admiration for Christian McCaffrey as a player. I think we all do have that sort of admiration. I do see Jabril Peppers, going at the end of the first round in a lot of these in mock drafts. In terms of Jabril Peppers being, in that hybrid safety linebacker mold, and the Seahawks maybe needing more depth there. I mean, what are your thoughts on Jabril Peppers versus, say, Budda Baker? What do you see either one being a better player, or which one would be a better fit for Seattle?
I think it's the same. It really is the same, and you can throw Justin Evans into the mix as well. I mean, Justin Evans is going to have he's the safety at Texas A&M. He's going to have a spectacular combine. I know that Jabril Peppers is listed, I think, at 6'1" and 200 and something pounds by Michigan. I think what we're probably going to find out is at the combine he's about 5'10", 5'11", and a bit lighter, probably sub 200 pounds, maybe 205, something like that. So you end up putting Budda Baker and Justin Evans and Jabril Peppers into the same kind of jar. And what they would be in Seattle is, and this is the problem I have with this type of pick, what they would be in Seattle is somebody who would be covering the slot at best. And that would be a role dependent on the opponent. You know, are you going to need somebody to be playing in the slot of that kind of skill set? If a team puts Mike Evans in the slot, are you going to have to kick Richard Sherman in and then put Justin Evans or Budda Baker or Jabril Peppers out wide on the outside? And do you want to do that? I think that teams will spend scheming against the fact you're playing an undersized safety in the slot corner. And unless they're really, really dynamic slot corners in the way that Tyrann Mathieu can handle that situation, you're going to have problems there. And the other position they'll play is backup free safety or backup strong safety for your Peppers. And, is that really, if it doesn't work out as a slot corner, do you really just want to be drafting a backup safety in the first round? So as much as I really like Jabril Peppers and I really like Budda Baker and I really like Justin Evans, I find it really hard to sort of think that that's going to be the direction the Seahawks going. Obi Melifonwu is a different prospect completely, because you look at him and he's like 6'3", 220 odd pounds. He's kind of in that Brandon Browner, Deshaun Shed type size, really dynamic athlete. And you think, okay, if Melifonwu, you could try him at outside cornerback. You could say that, they transitioned Deshaun Shed from safety to corner, so that could be an option for them. He could cover the big slot receiver, tight end, and Mike Evans type receiver if you needed him to, because of his size and his quickness and his leaping ability and his length. You could try him. I mean, he's only 3 pounds lighter than Deion Jones, who's the inside linebacker in Atlanta. So if he's only 3 pounds lighter than Deion Jones, could he play a little bit of linebacker? Yeah, potentially. And could he be a backup safety? Yes. So you're talking about sort of 3 or 4 different roles that he could fill there, which makes the pick more justifiable. Whereas with Budda Baker and Evans and Peppers, you're maybe looking at slot receiver, backup safety. And I'm not sure the value is there for a first-round pick for
that. Looking again at this mock draft by Dan Kadar, I think we've talked a lot about some of the good cornerbacks in the first round. But, man, if things fell in the way that Dan Kadar saw for the second and third round, the cornerbacks, let's say that the Seahawks take a offensive lineman in the first round or trade down. We can talk about that as well. But, I mean, in the second round alone, he's got Teez Tabor, cornerback, going 35th. Garyon Conley going 37th. Sidney Jones going 42nd. Tre'Davious White going 43rd. Desmond King going 44th. He's got more cornerbacks. Adoree Jackson going 53rd. Cordia Tankersley going 60th. Kevin King going 61st after the Seahawks pick, and I know how much admiration you have for Kevin King, and Chidobe Awuzie out of Colorado going 62nd. So what's that, like 8 cornerbacks going in the second round? This seems like a perfect opportunity if the Seahawks didn't have anyone at the first round, because I think this is also something that you've said in the past that I think applies so well to this as well, which is if a player like Garrett Bowles maybe Garrett Bowles doesn't quite qualify, but you would still be saying if a player has fallen to 26, why have they fallen? What's the thing that they did that you said, oh, they should be a 15th overall, top 15 pick, and they're available here at 26? Clearly something had gone wrong. And now maybe you're taking a guy who, had fallen for a reason that is for a good reason, as opposed to what the Seahawks normally do, which is take a guy way earlier than anyone expected them to do, a guy that they had projected for the third round or whatever, but they felt was being undervalued. So that's going to be a thing too, where if they're at a position where they don't want to take someone at 26 because the offensive linemen in the first round aren't that good, because it's not a situation where you've got 6 guys with a first round grade at tackle, so there's going to be a good one at 26. It's a situation where maybe nobody has a first round grade at tackle, so that means that you would assume that anyone that comes in at 26 isn't going to be that great. But let's say that Garrett Bowles does go in the top 10 and there's no one else available. I mean, if there's 8 second-round cornerbacks and the Seahawks have a needed cornerback, seems like the perfect opportunity for them to trade down, pick up an extra pick, pick up an extra late-round pick, something that allows them to get another pick in the second round, even if it's, picking up a 5th-round pick and packaging that with a 3rd-round pick to move back into the second round. How much do you love these cornerbacks in the second round, and how much do you love the idea of just picking up more second-round picks and shucking the first round once again?
It really depends, because there are scenarios where I think the Seahawks would really benefit from moving down. I mean, in Charlie Castle's mock draft, for example, they could probably move to the top of the second round. And I think the only player that left the board from a list of about 6 or 7 really attractive options was Hassan Reddick at the end of the first round. So if there's a guy you're going to take at 26, is there at 35 instead, then you can get an extra couple of picks. Then yeah, well, I mean, why wouldn't you do it? So, there are scenarios where I could see it being attractive to them. I don't think they will move up. I think if anything, they'd want to acquire at least one more pick. In terms of the cornerbacks, look, I think that there's a real sort of mixed view, and I really respect Dan's mock draft, but I think there's a couple of guys in that second round that are not going to be anywhere close to being available there. I think that Sidney Jones is a top 15 lock. A situation where he lasts into the second round. I think he's going to go top 15. I think Marshawn Lattimore is going to go top 15. I think Marlon Humphrey is going to go top 15. So they're the sort of the 3 that I'm really confident are going to go very early. And then I think it's when the interesting stuff happens, because a lot of people like Quincy Wilson at Florida. I've watched Quincy Wilson. I think there are things to like about his game, but he's not an athlete. He ran a 4.6 at the Spark Combine in 2013. I think that he is going to go later than a lot of people think. I don't think he's going to go in the first round. A lot of people don't realize that Tease Tabor, or Jalen Tabor as he used to be known, also ran a 4.6 at that 2013 Spark Combine and may not have a great combine. Don't bank on him running a 4.3 or a 4.4. And I think that he may drop as a consequence. Tre'Davious White should run well. I think that he's going to go in the first round. Garyon Conley has got a chance to run well. And if he runs in the 4.4s, he's probably going to go in the first round. Adoree Jackson is going to go in the first round, I think, because of his combination of character, his dynamic skill set in terms of a kick returner, be an instant X factor there, and punts and kickoffs. He's got an amazing character, so I think Adoree Jackson's going to go in the first round. And then there is a handful of others who could go in there. Kevin King, we've talked about, Rasul Douglas, Fabian Moreau. These are players who could sneak into the bottom of the first round, but maybe more likely to go in the second. So, Kevin King has got the potential to be a top 50 pick. So was Moreau. So was Rasul Douglas. There are other guys that are, I've watched them, and I think they're really great options. We talked about Howard Wilson at Houston. I think that he's got a chance to go second, third round. I think Akela Witherspoon, in terms of coverage, is fantastic. If anybody's ever watched him of his tape, there's a reason why he had 22 pass breakups, more than anybody else in the college football last year. He seems to get a paw on the ball so often. I mean, his tackling and his run support are absolutely horrific, and you'll want to sit down with him at the combine and just sort of poke holes in his tackling ability and stuff like that, and say, why are you not more interested in tackling it? And you want to sort of know whether it's within him, because if it is, he could be a second, third, fourth round pick. I mean, he's that good. You mentioned Cordrea Tankersley. He's a player who could really boost his stock with a great combine. Awuzie, length's going to be important for him. He's a good player. at the very least could be a decent slot corner for somebody. So, there are really, really good options right down the board for the cornerbacks. I think there's a chance we could see like 20 go in the first 3 rounds. That's how strong the class is overall. But the one thing to remember for the Seahawks, if we're going to bring this back to the Seahawks, is there's a reason why they have not taken a cornerback before the 4th round. They trust their assessment. They trust their ability to draft a set of particular physical traits and then bring that player into their system and then coach them up. And at cornerback, more than any other position, they've backed themselves to do this. It's not a surprise. Pete Carroll is an ex-secondary coach, has got a great way of doing things, the way they've developed cornerbacks in the past. It's a proven, tested system that they develop, and there's been a conveyor belt of talent there. It's run out of talent recently, but it was there before and it will be there again. I've no doubt about that. So if they're going to draft a cornerback early, as in the 1st round, it's probably going to have to be somebody incredibly freaky and dynamic and amazing. It's going to be somebody who runs incredibly fast, jumps out of the building, has an amazing broad jump, has an amazing vertical jump, runs a tremendous 3-cone and short shuttle, and probably runs in the 4.4s. If there is not that, and he's also 6'2", 6'3", and has the 32-inch arms. If that player's not there, then I don't think they're going to take a cornerback in the 1st round. But that's why Obi Melifonwu is so appealing, because you look at him and you look at the guy and you think that's a Seahawk right there. That's what a Seahawks defensive back looks like. So if he does everything that you would expect at the combine, he's going to be on their radar. No doubt about it. It's whether or not he's on the board at 26 or whether somebody else takes him before them. If he's on the board at 26, he could be the pick. The only thing that might stop him being Seattle's 1st round pick, to be perfectly frank, this year, and it might simply come down to Obi Melifonwu, maybe Kevin King, and whichever one of the linebackers is left. Hassan Reddick can run a 4.4. He could be the Seahawks pick if he stays at 26. Zach Cunningham could run a 4.4. He could be the Seahawks pick. Jared Davis could run and test very well at the Florida Pro Day. He could be the Seahawks pick. And that's kind of the range, assuming that Garrett Bowles is not there. They are the prospects that I'm focusing on right now. And to be perfectly honest, I'm not sure how much that is going to change over the next few weeks, unless there is a really impressive combine performance by someone like Moreau, for example, or Rasul Douglas, that puts their name amongst that list of players, or Tyus Bowser, for example, that will push their name into that list of players that we're looking at. It's looking pretty solid at the moment, the kind of names that we're going to need to be tracking over the next few weeks.
Yeah, we'll definitely dive deeper into the combine next week and the week after that when it actually begins, and try and get as much combine coverage as possible as the stuff comes in, because once you have those numbers and you can start creating your TEF scores or your Spark scores and all that kind of stuff, we're going to have a much narrower view of the types of players the Seahawks will be targeting. That being, especially, it's going to get difficult to do the day 2 and day 3 picks. But since we're here anyway, I mentioned it earlier, not everyone has I'll try and pull up another 2nd or 3rd round mock as we talk perhaps. But Dan has the Seahawks taking Dalvin Tomlinson, defensive tackle out of Alabama. It would be the 2nd year in a row that they did take a defensive tackle out of Alabama. Certainly, watching Jaron Reed last year, they did have an idea of what kind of player he was playing next to with Dalvin Tomlinson, a 5-year player at Alabama, and someone who seems to have a really good personality and locker room. Lots of people in the locker room seem to like him. He's written an article for the Players Tribune. Seems like a good personality and all that kind of stuff. I'm sure that you've watched Dalvin Tomlinson quite a bit, being that it is Alabama. Any thoughts on that? Because he's going here 58th overall. It's just after, in this mock draft, it's just after Carlos Watkins out of Clemson. Of course, Clemson just beat Alabama. And then just one ahead of Andy Vanderdoes at UCLA, and then a little bit ahead of Chris Wormley out of Michigan. So thoughts on Dalvin Tomlinson, and if that would be a good value there?
Yeah, I mean, I could imagine him being somebody the Seahawks like. Incredibly intelligent guy. He plays, I think, 3 instruments. We have talked about him in the past. I think one of the pieces I wrote for Field Goals this year touched on him as a potential Seahawks option. Has been through a lot in his life, and adversity and showing grit and determination is something the Seahawks value very highly. And he's done that. He's had to battle injuries. He's had to battle personal loss within his family life and his situation there. He's really tough. And although he's not an amazing pass rusher or anything, he's tough to move. He's a typical Alabama defensive lineman. There's a couple of reasons why I'm not convinced the Seahawks will go in that direction. One, of course, is the fact that Pete Carroll has already mentioned that their biggest needs are quarterback, linebacker, and offensive line. So I suspect that will be the focus in the draft, especially given the great depth in the secondary and at linebacker in the first 2 rounds. The other thing is he maybe is a little bit like Jaron Reed, and another second-round pick for a very similar skill set. Seems a little bit rich for a non-pass rusher. And the other thing to consider, I think, is that I actually think one of the, and maybe we'll come on to this in a minute, Kenny, but one of the positions in free agency where there is quite a lot of depth is the defensive line. And the Seahawks don't have quite as much cap room as we initially all thought they would have. And compare it to the rest of the league, it's not much at all. I think the Seahawks are like 23rd for cap room. So, they're in the bottom third for teams with free cap room. So they're going to have to be creative somewhere. And I think one of the areas they may actually be able to find some value is on the defensive line. So I wouldn't be surprised if they bring in a couple of veteran defensive linemen to add to the rotation, maybe another edge rusher, as well as looking at the offensive line. So I think that is somewhere the second wave of free agency could be somewhere where the Seahawks look to add a defensive lineman or 2.
And just because I said that I would do it, just looking at Walter Football, they had a second-round pick of Carlos Watkins. I mentioned the defensive tackle. And his previous pick was Adam Bisnavati, who we've talked about quite a bit on the podcast. But you're going to love their 3rd-round pick. Who do you think that Walter Football has the Seahawks drafting in the 3rd round, 90th overall, that you don't think will be available in the 1st round?
Hassan Reddick.
Correct. Hassan Reddick, 90th overall.
Yeah, if he's their 90th overall, maybe they'll take me in the 4th round. It's just I've said this a few times now on the blog, but I think it's worth repeating. If you run a 4.4 and you're 230 pounds and you can play all 3 linebacker spots and you have 22.5 tackles for a loss in a single season and 10.5 sacks, and you can rush the passer, and then you go to the Senior Bowl and you blow everything up and you end up leading the North team as the focal point of the team, and you show you can do absolutely anything that is asked of you, and you have tremendous grit and character. The Temple team, what they do is they give the 10 or the 9 toughest players on the team numbers 1 to 9. I think if you're one of the toughest players on the team, you get a single-digit number, and Reddick was number 7 in 2016 because he was one of the toughest players. So basically, everything about him is top 20. Athleticism, production, character is top 20. Ryan Shazier was being mocked sort of in a similar way a couple of years ago, and he ended up being the number 15 overall pick. So, I think it'd be joyous if Hassan Reddick makes it to number 26. I think the Seahawks will run to the podium if he's there at 26. I think it's probably more likely he's going to go 16 to Baltimore, 17 to Washington, or 22 to Miami.
Moving into free agency and away from the drafts here so that we have enough time to talk about free agency before the end of the show. One quick question before we start some of the other teams maybe, but how important is it for the Seahawks to sign Justin Britt to an extension this year and not wait until his contract expires next year?
I'd wait personally. I would wait. Justin Britt has had one good year as a pro, and I want to see him do it again next year. I'm willing to take the risk that you lose him to see if he has a good year. I just don't. If you go to him now and say we want to extend you are you going to get a bargain? Are you going to get a better price than you would in a year's time? I'm not convinced that you would. I'm also not overly convinced that, if he gets on the open market, that he's going to get, mega money anywhere that you would not be willing to pay. I mean, if he goes on the market in a year's time, let's say, and someone offers him $6.5 million a year, which is what J.R. Sweezy got, you might be willing to pay that to have a centre who's performed well for two years in a row. So I don't think it'd be the end of the world if you were sort of put in that kind of position. So I would personally play it by ear for now. If they did sign him to an extension this offseason, great. No issue with that. I'm not saying that I'd be against him signing a contract extension or that I think it would be a bad move. But if you're asking me what I think would be the best thing to do, I'd say to Justin Britt, here's your opportunity to make a lot of money this year. Go and have a second successive great season at centre.
Looking around, I've been looking at other teams' free agents, and I'm going through the process. I've done looks like about 7 so far, and we'll try and get it done before March 9th. And we can talk briefly about some of these teams. I mentioned some of the guys with the Raiders with you in an email offline. Some of their free agents include Malcolm Smith, who of course won the Super Bowl MVP with the Seahawks, Perry Riley, a linebacker, cornerback, DJ Hayden, offensive tackle, Menelik Watson, and certainly Hayden and Watson fall into the needs that we've talked about already. And a reunion with Smith, well, I don't think that would happen. There's a reason that he was too expensive for them to keep around as their third best linebacker. And, he's played well enough, I think, to get another contract that will pay him, a few $1 million per year or something like that. And the other guys they have there, John Kondo, Nate Allen, Andre Holmes, Britton Trawick, Darren Bates, Michael Rivera, Matt McGloin, Stacey McGee. In terms of maybe Menelik Watson or any of the other names that maybe one or two that stood out to you, what are your thoughts on Watson and the Raiders free agents?
I think Watson, because he's British, I have to automatically say that I think he'll be a fantastic free agent signing. At least he was born over. I think he was born in Manchester, so it'd be nice to get a Brit on the team. Seriously, he's a player that was really intriguing, sort of coming into the draft. I think he was a second-round pick from Florida State. Had the physical potential to be somebody that you would want to draft and develop, and maybe down the line would become a really effective offensive lineman. It hasn't really happened for him in Oakland, but I could imagine the Seahawks looking at him. Bit of competition. It won't break the bank. Competition, right tackle. I think that he's the type of player that I think ultimately. I know it's not what people want to hear. I think people want to hear that we think they're going to go and sign Kevin Zeitler, or they're going to sign Andrew Whitworth, or they're going to sign whoever else, Calais Campbell. I know that's what people want to hear. They want to believe that that's possible, but I don't think it is. So I think that Menelik Watson is somebody that ultimately they're probably going to look at on the offensive line. Unless Riley Reif does not get the kind of money that he's looking for, or I don't think that he's going to be an option for them. I think he may be too rich for them. Matt Khalil might be somebody they look at if he doesn't get offered big money anywhere else. He could be an option potentially. I know that some people quite like Byron Bell. So that's the type of player that you're looking at. I mean, yeah, I think that there's every chance that Menelik Watson, I think that in terms of potential upside and cost and being a cost-effective move, he might be the best option on the free agent market on the offensive line. But if that's it, I keep sort of thinking, I wonder if there's a trade in there somewhere. Is there a deal to be done with somebody to get a veteran right tackle or left tackle in there? Because that means you're not having to pay necessarily over the odds. The contract might be a fixed term. It might be a sort of a 2 or 3 year deal, or 2 or 3 years left on a deal that you're bringing in. You're getting a guy at a cost that you know that you're kind of like Jimmy Graham. You know how much it's going to cost you for the next 3 years. I just wonder if there's a move to be done like that, potentially for maybe like a 3rd round pick or 2nd round pick to address that need, because the Seahawks, as much as I believe they have a lot of faith in this young offensive line, I also don't think they necessarily want to be relying totally on it to take the next step, because the last thing anybody wants is to be 6 weeks into the 2017 season saying this offensive line's still not good enough and they didn't do enough to address it in the offseason. So I think that if there's going to be an aggressive move anywhere, I think it could be on the O-line.
The Miami Dolphins, a couple of their guys, Jermon Bushrod, a former left tackle. I think he's a little old and a little bit too much like Jamarcus Webb sort of route for them to entertain that. So in terms of the offensive linemen with the Miami Dolphins, I don't see anything too interesting. They've got a pretty long list of free agents and some high profile-ish guys, linebacker Donald Butler, tight end Jordan Cameron, wide receiver Kenny Stills, safety Bakari Rambo, who was with the Seahawks at one point, I believe, Jelani Jenkins, and cap casualties, including Mario Williams and Earl Mitchell, could be cut. I think Mario Williams is a guarantee to get cut. But two defensive ends that really interest me at this point would be Deion Jordan and Andre Branch. Deion Jordan hasn't played in 2 years. Disappointing number 3 overall pick out of Oregon. And Andre Branch, a second-round pick by the Jaguars in 2012, played for Gus Bradley for a few years, signed a 1-year deal with the Miami Dolphins, played decently. And since these are sort of drafty guys, do you have any thoughts on these two defensive ends, Deion Jordan and Andre Branch? Maybe not even necessarily what do you think of them in terms of free agents? Do either one of them have attractive qualities to you?
Well, you just can't trust Deion Jordan. I mean, he had all the talent in the world, and the reason that he's not been a success in the NFL is nothing to do with talent or athletic upside. So I'm not sure that you could put any kind of level of faith in him. Andre Branch, I thought he was like a second round pick in the draft, and he just hasn't really been able to, like quite a few Clemson pass rushers actually, he's not been able to repeat the success he had in college at the next level. So he is potentially somebody that they could look at. I just think that maybe what they might do on the defensive line is, first of all, consider adding quite a big name to their pass rush rotation. So get another edge rusher in who is not going to break the bank, but is still fairly established. And the name that I kind of interests me the most is Connor Barwin at Philadelphia, because he is a potential cap casualty. I think his salary is something like $7-8 million anyway for this year, so that he might be able to work some kind of a trade out if he isn't cut. Connor Barwin ran a 4.47, I think he was, at his combine, and he's only 30 years old, so it's not like he's like 35 or anything. He probably isn't running a 4.4 now, but that's the kind of athlete that he is. He had, I think, it's like 5 or 6 sacks in the recent season, but that was playing in a defense that doesn't really suit him. I think that he could be kind of a Leo option for them. And one of the things they had in 2013 that was so great was that they had a rotation that involved Cliff Averill, Chris Clemens, Michael Bennett. They had interior pressure as well with Clinton McDonald. They had a really deep rotation there. And, the idea of putting Barwin with Averill, Clark, and Bennett, I just think, that looks like a really fantastic quartet. Cassius Marsh can get involved as well. So, I like the idea of that. And if you could get him for $5-6 million for a year, that is something that I would consider, in the way that New England, for example, took a punt on Jabal Sheard and Chris Long and managed to get some production out of those guys. Is this a similar kind of move for Seattle to go and get Connor Barwin? And the other thing that I would is add some interior guys that are, at a right kind of price. So I'm not talking about, going out necessarily and spending $12 million on Calais Campbell, which every team in the league is going to have some interest in that guy. It's looking at sort of the second level guys. Like, first of all, how much is Dontari Poe going to cost? How much is Nick Fairley going to cost? How much is Avery Jones at Jacksonville going to cost? And you kind of go down the list. Carl Klug is somebody who's had a bit of production in this league. Is he somebody that you can potentially have a look at? What kind of a contract is Terrell McClain at Dallas going to be getting in free agency? He's been a really cool rotation guy for Dallas, and I just wonder if he's somebody the Seahawks could look at. there are other names as well. I mean, there are some out of all the positions. I think defensive line is one where there are quite a few intriguing players that you might just want to sort of think, hey, you know what? We'll get a couple of these guys, work them into the interior rotation. They're not necessarily going to be Calais Campbell, but they might just help keep this thing moving along. Benny Logan's another one at Philadelphia. It looks as if he's going to be moving on. So, players like that you can bring in that are going to maybe cost as much as a Taba Rubin, but can provide really good depth and rotation pieces to the D-line for next year.
Definitely. I mean, trades will be, and that's something too. That's the thing that'll be really interesting in terms of the trades, is that they're almost always unpredictable. They're guys like Jimmy Graham, guys like, guys that you didn't know were on the trade block will suddenly be dealt, and the releasing of certain players, is always sort of surprising with Josh Sitton last year, and you never know who's going to be out there, and so it'll be interesting within the next month or two because I think the Seahawks are more interested in trades, just because typically the players acquired on trades are, they're coming on contracts that, maybe more reasonable than ones that would be signed in 2017, where the cap space goes up and, contracts continue to get inflated to the point where, there's going to be those situations where I think if the guy's on a rookie deal, or if a guy's, on a deal that he signed at a time when maybe there wasn't as much of a demand as there would be for that same position today, trades can be more effective than free agency, which is why you've seen the Seahawks use draft picks to acquire Marshawn Lynch, Sidney Rice, Percy Harvin and Jimmy Graham. So it's going to be out there. The Giants have some interesting decisions to make. Jason Pierre-Paul, he was on a 1-year tag and contract, and now the Giants have to decide what to do with him, because he's now it's back to where it was like before he blew a couple of fingers off of his hand. Now it's back to like, okay, now he's going to get a huge deal. Before he had to take a 1-year, $10 million deal because of his hand injury. He's had a really good season, and he's still pretty young. So there's going to be Jason Pierre-Paul out there. There's going to be Jonathan Hankins, who's a defensive tackle who had a really good season, and he's going to be a free agent. He's only 24. The Seahawks do have needs at defensive tackle, and offensive lineman Will Beatty and Marshall Newhouse are guys that I had talked about. And so really with the Giants, I think the biggest thing would be whether or not any of these offensive linemen, Beatty and Newhouse, could help fill a role for the Seahawks this year, because I don't think that Jason Pierre-Paul is going to be coming to the Seahawks. And they've already cut Victor Cruz and Rashad Jennings. So there's a couple other guys out there, but I don't think needs for Seattle. Any thoughts on those Giants players that I mentioned?
I think that, some of the players the Giants are going to be losing are going to cost quite a lot of money. JPP is going to cost. If he leaves anywhere, I think he's going to probably get a 1-year, 2-year type deal for fair money. For his position. Hankins inside is probably going to get a lot of money. I would imagine he's probably going to get. He's a candidate, Jonathan Hankins, to get overpaid potentially. Because he's done a decent job. He's not been a bad pick for them from Ohio State. I think he was was a player that was tipped to go really early in the draft and then slipped into round 2. I think conditioning's always been an issue with him, but he's 25, and you could imagine him getting a really big deal from somebody else or by New York and never quite living up to it. So I'm not sure there's anybody that I'm particularly interested in. I mean, I think the players that I would be most interested in are Terrell McClain, who I mentioned there at Dallas. I'd love to see him. He's a guy who only had a $1 million contract this year for Dallas. I think he's worthy of a sort of a $2.5 million type contract. If you can get him for 2.5, I think that you bring him in to be in the rotation, and he could be really good. I think that Lawrence Guy at Baltimore is another player that I would look at. Benny Logan at Philadelphia, who I didn't really like when he was at LSU, but I've seen him a couple of times for Philly, and there is something there that you could possibly work with. Sly Williams at Denver is a player that I would see. What's his value going to be as a free agent? He's a bit older. He's going to be 29 soon, but again, is a player that I would look at. Cole Klug, who I mentioned, is a player that I would look at. Avery Jones is another candidate to maybe get a bit overpaid because he's younger at Jacksonville and seems to have a lot of admirers. So I would sort of touch base with him and sort of see what his situation is. And, Dontari Poe and Nick Fairley as well. I mean, they're the guys that I think I would be focusing a lot on. I think if you could get 3 or 4 players, if you could get someone like Connor Barwin to be an edge rusher, if you could get somebody to, 1 or 2 players to add to the interior rotation, if you get Terrell McClain and another, and if you could get a veteran offensive tackle from somewhere, then I think that would set you up really well to go into the draft needing to address cornerback, linebacker, get another offensive lineman at some point for competition's sake, maybe draft someone like Elijah Hood to be a running back and get some safety help as well. I think if you could, that would be sort of that is what I would view a realistic off-season for the Seahawks.
I think the LA Chargers, just kind of keep on saying it so that I can get used to it, but the LA Chargers, in addition to having Corey Toomer, another Seahawks draft pick from 2012 that just makes the class even better of that 2012 class, because he's had a pretty good season. He had 71 tackles and he only made 8 starts, a sack and 3 forced fumbles. So Corey Toomer, he's a restricted free agent, so I imagine that the Chargers will be bringing him back and seeing what his development shows in 2017. But I think they've got some really interesting names, mostly in the guys that they could make cap casualties. Melvin Ingram is a guy that could get the franchise tag. He's had 18.5 sacks in the last 2 years. So, interesting to see what happens with Melvin Ingram. But he's less of an athlete and less athletically gifted than Bruce Irvin was when the Seahawks chose Bruce Irvin over Melvin Ingram. But on the cap casualty front, there's Orlando Franklin, the offensive guard, and DJ Fluker, the former tackle/guard. Any thoughts on DJ Fluker if he becomes available? Because I don't think that necessarily it's likely. He is on the 5th-year option picked up for DJ Fluker, but he's also not necessarily playing so well that I couldn't see them maybe moving on before they have to, which is March 9th. They can still get away from the guarantee. After that, his salary becomes guaranteed. But any thoughts on DJ Fluker or Melvin Ingram?
I really didn't like DJ Fluker in the draft process, and he went really, really early. He's moved inside to guard. If the Seahawks' main priority was to get a huge guard, then I would say yes, I'd have some interest there. But I don't have any confidence in him playing right tackle. He's already made that transition once, I believe, or at least it was touted at some point. So I wouldn't be too interested there. I've never been a huge Ingram fan. I think in the draft when he was at South Carolina, he just looked like a cannonball. Really, he wasn't didn't have the length. Was a really unnatural shape. There isn't really anybody like Melvin Ingram in the league. Was a unique player, but fair play to him. Has made some. Has had a lot of success recently. I am in sort of when I put the mock drafts together, I venture onto a lot of different team forums just to get a feeling for what they believe their biggest needs are, or to see if there's anybody talking in the way that we talk about Pete Carroll expressing their needs. Are there any hints that we can, or any information we can glean from this? And one thing I've noticed a lot going on some of the different forums to get this information is that nearly every fan base wants Calais Campbell, and an awful lot of fan bases want Melvin Ingram. People like the Colts and Miami and people like that, their fan bases are really hoping that they go after Melvin Ingram. So if he doesn't get the franchise tag, I think he's going to get paid an obscene amount of money. And ultimately the Seahawks will, even if they were interested in the player, they won't be interested in the cost.
Just a couple more before we wrap up. The Dallas Cowboys have some interesting players. Obviously, I've talked about how I see their sort of demise coming together with the cap situation and the amount of players they're set to lose. So they've got a lot of work to do even after they figure out what to do with Tony Romo and his June 1st. If they can save some money there, obviously it'll help. But still, they've got a lot of guys potentially going on the way out, and guys that are at positions that the Seahawks do need, like cornerback and offensive line. The cornerbacks include Morris Claiborne and Brandon Carr. and then the offensive lineman Ronald Leary and John Cooper. And, Ronald Leary's played well next to all these great players. Jonathan Cooper was, the 6th or 8th overall pick a few years ago, and obviously he's had a tough go of it with his career. And Morris Claiborne, former 6th overall pick that, only started to have show some signs of that potential this year before being injured. So with that being said, Claiborne, Leary, Cooper, obviously Leary is going to get talked a lot about with any team that needs an offensive lineman, but I would say that quite leery myself of signing him to a big deal. And he's got some degenerative sort of issues that say this might be his last sort of go around, his last chance to get a contract. So with the Cowboys free agents, any thoughts there?
Yeah, you're right about he has a degenerative, you know what I mean? You know what I'm trying to say? He has a knee issue. He has a bad knee. So I think that when he was going through the draft process, he went undrafted because of this. And I think that it's one of the reasons why teams have been swayed away from signing him when he's been a restricted free agent and stuff like that. So I don't think that anybody's going to offer him sort of big money because of the problems with the knee and being wary of that. And with Seattle, he would only be a left guard probably. So I'm not convinced that they're going to go down that road. Claiborne is another one whereby, if people remember, the Cowboys traded up in the draft, traded up to I think number 6 in the draft to go and get him, made a really big move to go and do that, thinking that he was going to be the next big thing. A lot of people thought that Morris Claiborne was better than Patrick Peterson when he was drafted, and it never happened. And then he kind of was on the brink of seemingly being cut or traded. I think he was on the trade block for a time, and then he turned his career around and had a bit of success in Dallas. I'd be very leery, to use that word again, of very wary of going after him, because he seems to me like he's a bit of a Byron Maxwell in that, 1 minute he will look really great and the next minute he will not look really great. And the cost again of going after somebody like that, especially when you're presented with a draft class loaded with cornerbacks where you could probably come out, by the end of round 3, especially with the potential compensatory picks the Seahawks will have, maybe at least 2 in round 3, 2 picks in round 3 as a consequence of this. You could come out with 2 cornerbacks in this draft and feel really good about them on contracts that are never going to break the bank. So I would much rather go down that road than look at this veteran cornerback market.
Well, one more today, which was the Buffalo Bills. They've got some interesting names. Lorenzo Alexander, who had the breakout season with 12.5 sacks at age 33. Reggie Bush, might get one more go around, and whether or not there's a reunion between him and Pete Carroll, I think it's possible. I wouldn't fight against it because Reggie Bush isn't going to cost anything. Zach Brown, who, had a big year at linebacker this season. Stephon Gilmore, the former 10th overall pick, though he has 31-inch arms, just like Morris Claiborne. Running back Mike Gillislee, who led the league in yards per carry with 5.7. EJ Manuel, right tackle Jordan Mills, who's going to be a tackle out there, 34-inch arm, 6'5", 315 pounds. They got a ton of other free agents, and we listed them all off. It would take another hour to get through this podcast. And then their cap casualty candidates, like you talked about, Tyrod Taylor, insanely enough, and veteran defensive tackle Kyle Williams, which, he might have one more great season in him or something like that. He's 33 years old and, at a cap hit of $8.3 million, maybe too expensive for Buffalo, especially with new coaching staff and, trying to redo things once again. I'm especially curious about Reggie Bush and Jordan Mills. Any thoughts there with those players as well as Kyle Williams?
I think the only one that I'd be interested in of the list of names you've just presented there will be Zach Brown at Buffalo, because I remember in 2012, Pete Carroll had said that one of the things they really needed was speed in the front 7 before that draft. So we were projecting that I was mocking a linebacker to Seattle in round 2. a fast linebacker, and there was three options really. So the two options that I was bouncing between, and that was Michael Kendricks, who was the one who went just before Bobby Wagner, who ended up in Philadelphia, and there was Zach Brown, who was 5 picks after Bobby Wagner. I was mocking Wagner to the late first round, and he fell into round 2, and the Seahawks got him. So we thought that Wagner was going to go in round 1. Seahawks got him. That was great. But I just wonder if Wagner wasn't there, whether the Seahawks would have gone after Zach Brown. He's a tremendous athlete. I've always liked him. I liked him when he was at Tennessee. He ran a 4.44 at 244 pounds, which is frankly incredible. That kind of speed and closing ability. Rex Ryan saw something in him and has got a lot more out of him than the Tennessee staff did. I would be putting a call into him and saying, keep us up to date with your situation in free agency. Let us know what the kind of offers you're being made, because if you could get Zach Brown in Seattle on a relatively cheap looking deal, then I would definitely consider that. He's a really dynamic, big linebacker, just like KJ Wright, just like Bobby Wagner. If you could get another one like that to play next to them or rotate with them, I think that would be a fantastic signing. I really like Zach Brown.
Yeah, it could be interesting to see what happens there if the Bills bring him back and where he goes this year. And certainly it's going to be great to see the combine in a couple weeks and free agency shortly after that. And we can really start talking about what this team and what the other teams will look like in 2017 and what their real needs will be in the draft when the draft comes around. Because, right now we can say what their needs are, but what their draft needs are, well, we don't know yet. That's it for the Valentine's Day edition of 3000 NFL Mock Draft. Rob, do you have any final thoughts? I always call this segment Rob's Final Thoughts, and I always go to you one last time to make sure I'm not, cutting you off from something you wanted to say this week on the podcast. So, Rob's final thoughts.
Well, just a very, quick final thought that if you want to go and watch any prospects that you want to watch some game tape this week or whatever, let me just sort of give you some names to go for there. I've written about some of these guys on the blog this week, so check through the post that we put up there if you want to have a look. Tedrick Thompson, we talked about, go and watch him. Colorado safety, great range, great ball skills. Could easily imagine him coming in as a sort of a mid-round option to provide some depth at safety there. Go and watch Johnson, the Boston College safety. He could be another alternative. Go and watch Howard Wilson, the Houston cornerback, really fun player. Tyus Bowser at Houston is a linebacker. Go and watch him play. Anzalone and Davis, the two Florida linebackers, are worth keeping an eye on. If you haven't seen Hassan Reddick, go and see him. Melifonwu, we've talked about. Cunningham, we've talked about. Bowles, we've talked about. I would, and a lot of people don't like Kevin King's tape against USC, but I think it's a great example of how he can stick with receivers. He does not get beat over the top. He's very good working across the middle, so I'd go and check that one out. Go and find anything you can on Keller Witherspoon out there, and just go and admire how well he defended. If you could go, you can find this on YouTube. Go and watch Keller Witherspoon against Washington, because he covers John Ross for the most part, and I don't think I've seen a cornerback cover John Ross as well as anybody. Better than Witherspoon. So he is a really underrated player at the moment. Just wish his tackling and his physicality was a bit better. Elijah Hood, Shalom Dewani, Rasul Douglas, Fabian Moreau. These are kind of some of the names that I think I'm going to be trying to watch even more of going into the combine. The combine's going to be, it's a little bit later this year, but in 3 weeks' time, we'll get a better angle on the kind of players they're going to be drafting. We kind of have a good idea of what they look for at linebacker and running back and offensive line and cornerback. So, we will be able to sort of present a great list of targets that you can go on, some new names, maybe some players to go and have a look at. So good, it's exciting. It's a really interesting draft class. Get excited about the draft class. The combine can't get here soon enough. It's a little bit weird that we have this kind of pocket without anything now. We've had the Super Bowl and then we have to wait for ages for the combine. But I think it's going to be worth it this year, Kenny. I think it's one of the more interesting draft classes in a long time. And the best thing is it kind of fit apart from the offensive line. It really fits with kind of some of the positions that the Seahawks are looking to upgrade this season.
All right, well, there you have it. Those are Rob's final thoughts. Follow him on Twitter at Rob Staten and go to SeahawksDraftBlog.com. Check out fieldgoals.com. And that's it. Thanks for hanging in there from the 2-week hiatus. And we'll be back next week and, the combine the week after that. Plenty of draft stuff to be talking about, and we'll see what happens between now and then. So happy Valentine's Day, Rob.
Happy Valentine's. You know what, Kenny? I think I've spoken more to you today than I have my own wife. So with a combination of work and podcast. So happy Valentine's Day, Kenny.
And happy Valentine's Day to all the lovely listeners out there. We'll see you next week.